Y es así que, de manera muy rápida, porque sé que todos ustedes conocen sobre museología perfectamente, pero para mí era importante hacer este contexto para decirles de dónde partimos en los procesos museológicos. Y bueno, queremos distanciarnos de esta visión de un museo eurocentrista o de un museo del templo sagrado o del museo patria. Estamos convencidos que los museos tienen que ser espacios de diálogo, de intercambio, de construcción, de reflexión, sobre todo para construir sociedades más justas, porque los museos sin los públicos no existirían. Claro, va de la mano con los procesos de investigación, curatoriales, museográficos, etcétera, pero todo ello se ve reflejado en las personas. Guillermo Bonfil en los 80 decía que la sociedad moderna despoja a los sectores populares de la iniciativa cultural y los convierte en consumidores, y no en creadores. Y reconocer esta creación era fundamental o es fundamental para la participación activa de los sectores populares. Él incluso estaba en desacuerdo en poner el nombre del museo como arte popular justo por esta razón, porque él decía que somos productores de cultura popular. Y eso se tendría que ver reflejado tanto en los proyectos expositivos como en todas estas actividades que los acompañan.
En el 2019, el colectivo Allende, después de un proceso de autoinvestigación y de acercamiento con sabedores y sabedoras del pueblo Kamsha, se logró realizar la primera exposición en el Museo de Sibundoy, dirigida por mujeres y hombres pertenecientes al mismo pueblo. En este espacio, las actividades surgieron después de un acercamiento de la palabra alrededor del Xinjiang, espacio que permitió armonizar el museo y trasladar esta forma propia de comunicación en la voz que tendría lugar por primera vez el pueblo Kamsha en el museo. Fue significativo cómo un grupo de personas del pueblo Kamsha resignificaron este espacio a través de nuestra propia voz, hablando sobre la ley de origen y lo que significa para el pueblo Kamsha los elementos que se encuentran en ese lugar y que lastimosamente para el museo son objetos inertes de un pasado, tiempo y espacio que poco se ha cuestionado el pueblo, pero que esta primera experiencia nos brinda la posibilidad de cuestionarnos y descubrirlos con el mismo pueblo, con aquellos que tienen gran conocimiento de la cultura, como también con aquellos que por primera vez conocían el museo y compartían la palabra en este lugar un tanto desconocido. De esta forma se logró intervenir la calle al frente del museo con el nombre Allende, lugar de vida, como un sello y expectativa a los habitantes. Se habilitó una entrada que por años no era utilizada. En el pasillo se llevó plantas medicinales como espacio de armonización y protección a curadores y a quienes participaron en ese momento, teniendo en cuenta que la energía espiritual en el museo en muchas ocasiones afecta a las personas o en nuestro conocimiento se le llama mal viento. Se hizo saumerio en el espacio y se dejaron lapiceros para responder a preguntas como ¿qué haces para cuidar el planeta? Se realizó el mural Ley de Origen del Pueblo Kamsha con la orientación Sigue la Línea, estrategia que posibilitó no preocuparnos por la técnica o si somos o no pintores, sino en transmitir el conocimiento y vivencia de los abuelos y de nosotros como Kamsha. Asimismo, la idea del mural era dejar que durante los días de exposición las personas que nos visitaban también participen en este ejercicio siguiendo la línea. En la segunda parte del recorrido se aclaró que no es carnaval, sino Buxnaté o Bollejuaité o Clestrinch a la celebración del nuevo año del pueblo Kamsha y que gran parte de esta celebración ha sido impuesta o transformada por la Iglesia. Es una celebración que se conjuga en presente y no en pasado, y que la información que se brinda en el museo acerca del pueblo Kamsha es errónea y sin fundamento y participación del pueblo Kamsha para su autorrepresentación. Los elementos que se encuentran en el museo se resignificaron como ofrendas teniendo en cuenta el conocimiento de los mayores y se dejó un escrito a partir de la investigación omitiendo palabras en pasado y precolombino. También se realizó una ofrenda, vísperas al Huacnaité, como muestra de respeto por los restos humanos que se encuentran en el museo, y también porque durante ese tiempo algunos compañeros soñaron a mayores o mamitas que han dejado la vida terrenal, pero que nuestro conocimiento se manifiestan a través de los sueños para que los recordemos en la ofrenda. Por último, se solicitó a las personas guardar silencio antes de ingresar a este lugar donde se encuentran las vasijas más grandes y los restos humanos. Como colectivo nos invadieron muchos sentimientos, que luego fueron de satisfacción porque se logró renombrar y ofrendar los elementos del museo de acuerdo a nuestra vivencia, experiencia y aprendizaje como Kamtrá, para compartir con el pueblo Kamtrá y el no indígena. Sentimos que nos empoderamos del museo y fuimos los primeros curadores indígenas en este lugar, contando a nuestro propio pueblo lo que pensamos, sentimos y aprendimos de él.
And it's something that we really discovered in Vancouver, that we were doing a lot of exhibitions if the exhibitions were community-based, but what we missed were those communities that would come together to Vancouver and only spend part of the year in Vancouver. For example, a large part of the Chinese population will spend just part of the year in Vancouver, but they're not being taken into consideration. And similarly, I think with Mexicans, they come to work and then they go back after a particular period of time. But they're part of that history, that complex mosaic that we have to cater for, and a richness which actually enriches all of us as a result. But I think these different theories and these representational practices, they need to be assessed against a nation's obligations after the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Articles 11, 12, and 31 refer to the Indigenous right to practice and revitalize cultural traditions, including the right to maintain, protect, and develop past, present, and future manifestations of their culture. By that, it includes archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technology, and visual and performative art. It includes measures of redress, including repatriation, and also Indigenous control of ceremonial objects. So the implication here is, in British Columbia, is that Indigenous communities have rights over objects in museums and can use those in ceremonies. And that is something that's actively practiced. Members of that community, so the person who inherited the title of Tequalatsa, Herb Joe, was told by his grandmothers, by his aunts, that really, you know, you have to go and find what happened to your ancestor, and he needs to be brought home. And so through various techniques, including dreams, but also including kind of research methods, Herb Joe, with the help of an anthropologist, actually found the transformation stone in the museum, in the Burke Museum. There was a dream that the stone wanted to come home. And there was also a feeling by the elders that all the disasters that had befell the Stolo community were partly a result of the ancestors having been forcefully taken away. Now, Herb Joe insisted for 2 years. This repatriation took about 15 years. He insisted for 2 years that the transformation stone in the museum was a person and not a thing. And that created, of course, problems with NAGPRA, with the US legislation on the for the return of grave goods. So finally, you know, there was a kind of a concession that was made. But it's interesting. Why make these concessions? It talks about the incommensurability between two ways of looking at the world. And the Tequalatsa was, so also NAGPRA only applies to the US, not to Canada. So, the stone was repatriated to a community on the American side of the border, who then repatriated it to the Stolo, to the Stolo nation. Something similar happened with the Gapskolets poll because the Swedish government, my understanding is, were very for the repatriation of the poll, and the museum directors were. But at some point, I'm not quite sure where the point, how this really happened, was that it was decided on the Swedish side that the poll was of a value of inestimable value to humanity. And therefore, the community had to show that it could preserve the pole. And of course, preservation, the idea of poles is that they decay in the forest now, and they go back into, and then they'll make copies. And so in a way, there's a whole system of reproduction that museums cut off by stopping that happening. And so what happened there was, so there was a kind of things didn't move for a while. So what happened was that, in fact, the repatriation went by the Museum of Anthropology, where we could provide the conditions that were required. And then from the Museum of Anthropology, we passed it on to the community.
¿Qué se hace con aquellos objetos, y tú lo mencionaste con el palo, aquellos objetos que según la epistemología de ciertos grupos indígenas no deben de conservarse y mucho menos exhibirse?
Conservation now, I mean, I'm thinking of people like Miriam Claver, who wrote a book called Valuing Things That Are Value, no recuerdo exactamente, pero she's a conservator, and she's talked about conservation having two parts. And conservation presents itself as a science, but in fact, what you have is you have scientific techniques and technologies to preserve material, and then you have values which actually determine how those techniques are applied. And so our argument is that really, yes, conservation in terms of the science, we preserve that, but the values have to be more in accord with individual societies, and where they're not meant to be preserved, then we should honor those wishes.
Entonces, cuando se llega a la comunidad, ya hay todo un proceso sí comunitario. Ir con las autoridades, presentarse, decirles lo que estamos haciendo, saber si tenemos el espacio para poder hacer las conferencias, los talleres, que obviamente compartamos las ideas y que ellos digan sí, pero también nos gustaría hacer esto. Entonces nosotros, como tal, al presentarnos, pues adquirimos como también estas necesidades, decimos, no, sí podemos. Entonces, el logotipo, por ejemplo, que se crea de Cotepec, pues tiene que ver de un interés de ambas partes, no solamente de un servidor como investigador, sino una cuestión de ellos, de comunidad y de una persona que también es parte de la comunidad. Entonces, en ese sentido, pues todo lo que ha sido en términos de lo que se ha hecho a nivel de talleres, de congresos, de conferencias para las comunidades, ha sido con su aceptación, ha sido con el hecho de que ellos nos generen esos espacios, que ellos también dispongan de sus propios alumnos para que nos den ese espacio, y de que en términos logísticos dentro de la comunidad, a manera en cómo se organiza cada comunidad, pues nosotros somos respetuosos con estos procesos. De aquí también parte el hecho de que próximamente, si se van a estar generando más talleres, más conferencias, pues tiene también que ser ya con una petición pues de las propias comunidades también, para que nosotros podamos ir y podamos asistir. No siempre ha sido así, siempre ha sido en un proceso muy respetuoso de las comunidades y tratando por la cuestión, sí, justamente de los recursos, de no desgastarlos tanto en términos de una cuota, porque en realidad eso no hay, sino más bien ha sido siempre en procesos de ayuda mutua, ¿no? Como se le conoce en las comunidades, y esto es, y es por esto, y es por esta razón que en realidad ha funcionado también el trabajo que se ha hecho con la comunidad, porque ellos se involucran, porque ellos acceden, porque ellos también piden, solicitan, porque ellos piden a los padres de familia, a los alumnos, a las autoridades que participen. Entonces se ha hecho de una manera muy ética, y esto ha funcionado más allá de la cuestión económica, que muchas veces siempre es como un siempre es como lo que puede a veces no hacer que los proyectos sucedan.
So this is an ongoing, iterative, multi-phase project. This is not something to do to document a collection well. You can't just take a pill and it's done. It is done in phases. And each phase enriches the quality of the collection and its documentation, and enriches the local community's understanding of their own material culture and language. So phase one was in 2016 to bring elders to the museum. It's very important to bring them to the museum. It's a life-changing experience for Indigenous people to come to a museum and see vast collections. We brought these elders to the museum to understand the purpose of a museum, what the project was about, and also the strengths and limitations of the museum. And it's actually been very helpful for our project for the Wowsha to realize that the museum doesn't have the information they have and needs their expertise. Then the second part of this phase one project was to video record their description of their culture. Very important to video record when you have an endangered language, and frankly, I think anytime. Especially in an oral tradition, you have a lot of gesturing associated with the oral presentation, and also for just as a matter of linguistic research in the future, you want people to be able to see the speech event and to get all the information that you would get if you were sitting in front of the speaker. So video recording is far preferable to audio, just mere audio recording. You want both. Then this is an overview, what I'm going to talk about. Phase two, you bring young scholars to the museum, and the elders have gone back home. Then the following year in 2017, we brought young scholars to the museum. One of them could not get a passport. The other one came. He's done a lot of work since then, and shared his knowledge with his colleagues back in the village. And you want to show, again, as you did with the elders, that you want to have them understand the strengths and weaknesses of museum collections, what they're missing, and why they're important. And then provide training in transcription and translation, as well as, this is very important, digital archive management, best practices for not losing files, how to use digital tools, naming conventions, file management, the whole 9 yards. Phase three, remote collaboration. After the young people go back, then you want to spread the training that you have given them. And you help young scholars that were trained, bring the transcription project back to the villages. And I designated local teachers to train the local youth in transcription of the language. Ironically, we were immensely helped by one aspect of COVID. It was in the past very difficult to get government help to install internet access in small villages. So there was you couldn't provide training remotely to small villages. When COVID occurred, NGOs insisted that it was essential for the preservation of life, and it's true, to install good internet access in all Indigenous villages, and it happened. And suddenly we can all have meetings, talk about transcription issues, all the villages can participate, and it's been very positive. In phase four, you want to bring video training back to the community. So first we brought, in phases 1 and 2, we brought people to the museum collection. In phase 3 and 4, we want to bring more knowledge from the collection and museum practices back to the community, and ethnographic practices. So we took high quality video cameras to the villages and trained the young people to record their elders speaking about traditional material culture technologies. I think it's kind of my bête noire. You have to work directly with the elders in the Indigenous language, because if you work with local translators, the old people kind of clam up. They feel inhibited. They don't like to be interrupted constantly while the young person translates to Portuguese. Get it in the Indigenous language. and the elders will speak volubly. You'll have a treasure, and then you have all the time in the world to transcribe it, translate it, and make sure that everyone can understand everything that's in it. One good outcome of having them do the transcriptions is that the kids, the young students, get a lot of exposure to the most eloquent forms of Wowsha speech that they don't always get to hear. Not everybody lives with one of these storytellers. Not everyone gets to hear this stuff all the time. And the thing is when they make the transcription, in order to include every syllable, even all that, just a little filler word, they have to hear it again and again. So they back it up, hear it again, back it up, hear it again, back it up, hear it again. They end up memorizing not only the content, but the forms of speech, the vocabulary. So it without noticing it, they are memorizing this stuff.
So if museums are to implement UNDRIP and accept, as in Canada and many Indigenous people in Canada, accept UNDRIP as a basis for decolonizing practices, we therefore need to accept Indigenous ways of knowing.
It's very important to work with the elders. I find so often people don't work with the elders because they don't speak the contact language. And so you either have to work with a local translator, or, it's just too much trouble. But you end up getting garbled versions of things. And I've seen cases where people make translation errors because the local translator was trying to quickly give the outsider an idea of what the elder was talking about in translation, and made an analogy that the anthropologist thought was literal. And so then this leaks into their publications. So yeah, it's really important to get the information only from articulate elders. Not all elders speak well. I would say, out of 700 Wowsha, there's like 4 or 5 elders that are really the most eloquent. And you want to work with them, and you want to make sure you get some from every village, and you want to work with women and men. Although sometimes you're surprised. The woman who gave this speech about masterclass in spinning cotton, I've known her since she was a child, and I always knew she inherited her father's intelligence. Her father was a very amazing man, but I'd never heard her speak like that. And I was surprised to hear how eloquent she was. So, sometimes you get surprises, but you want to make sure that you work with people whose speech is worthy of memorization and imitation. Now, the other thing is, I didn't mention, it's very important to let them modify the project. They always change my projects completely. Here's when I decided to bring these things back and have them film. I had enough, I was planning, my budget was, I was going to have one professor, traditional professor, give a master class, just as we'd done back in Washington, where you have 1 or 2 older guys giving this talk. Well, the woman who was in charge, who I had selected, she said, I would like my sister to participate as well. I said, okay. And then she said, and also my other sister. All right. And also my 2 other sisters. Is that okay? So we ended up with 5 women. But it was great, because as she spoke, it's true, the other ones had very little to say, but as she spoke, they would demonstrate, because they were all different kinds of cord that was being made. They showed different spinning techniques and so on. It was much better as a result. Plus, the woman in the red polka dot dress, she was tending her child at the same time. It was very interesting in terms of child care, how she corrected the child quietly, calmed the child, and so on. So them changing the structure of the interaction it always ended up better. And the young people, I've had to insist on training some of the young women. I put the camera in their hands and say, you got to do it because otherwise I can't pay you. So, you know, Greta's really hardcore. If she doesn't use the camera, there's no way that Greta's going to approve of me paying her. So, you know, reluctantly, shyly, giggling, they'll take the camera. And then sometimes the women would start teasing the girl who had the camera. And I said, no, this has to be a place of respect, a place of learning. And we're not going to tease each other. We're just going to encourage one another because we are learning so that we can teach our children and grandchildren. And, you know, they stopped and it became a very positive interaction.
Communities, we make a statement that communities are not the same. Not everybody in the community has got the same idea. So what we did was we had a display of a gigantic cannibal bird mask, this big thing. And we worked with a knowledge holder. We had 3 sentences on that mask. It's probably one of the most impressive things in the museum. 2 of those sentences, when we worked with the communities, were in error. And working with the community, we generated something like 16 or 17 pages on the ownership history, when it was painted, repainted. It was incredible. I mean, working with communities, it changes things so dramatically. So that was really kind of from the perspective of someone who thought all knowledge could be shared. The next was a contemporary artist from that community, and her grandfather, I think, had given some masks to the museum, and we showed those masks along with some contemporary artwork. She thought that, well, some things can be shared, but other things can't be shared. And then the third one was from a cultural worker in that community who believed that nothing should be shared because of its sacred nature. Everything was sacred. And so what we did was we used a mask. I mean, working with these people, and we covered the mask in a ceremonial cloth and put it out.
En la exposición, el curador menciona que los Kamtras provienen de la Polinesia. Así como él, otras personas también aseguran que venimos de la Polinesia, basados en un libro que fue publicado con una visión colonial, ignorando la lengua y nuestra historia. Nuestra lengua no se conecta con ninguna otra. Somos un pueblo milenario, así lo dice nuestra lengua. Kamuntra yentra, Kamuntra villa. También menciona el curador que las vasijas que se encuentran en el museo son provenientes de Nariño, y estas eran utilizadas por los Kamtras para labores domésticas. En ningún momento se menciona que las ollas de barro que elaboraron nuestros mayores con arcilla o con cangao, material que se encontraba en las orillas de la laguna, era una forma de realizar arte al interior de las familias Kamtras y se utilizaban para ofrendar a los seres queridos que dejaban la vida terrenal. Y se revela a través de sueños, pidiendo que se acuerden de él o ella y le ofrenden en su nombre los alimentos que eran preparados en ellas. Teniendo en cuenta lo anterior, consideramos una falta de respeto cuando observamos las vasijas de barro exhibidas con los restos humanos fuera de las urnas y teniendo total desconocimiento del lugar de origen de las ollas. En mi opinión personal, fue una experiencia desagradable. No me siento identificada con lo que dijo. Siempre habló en tiempo pasado, faltándole respeto a un pueblo milenario, que aún pervive en el tiempo y sigue transmitiendo sus conocimientos y sus saberes de generación en generación.
Number one, we've had the institutions that have done the collecting for centuries have negated the authority of the makers of the object in documenting it. So it really wasn't documented. You had some non-expert making things up about it, as happened with the ceramic pot that was misattributed and ridiculously described as being an armadillo when it was a caiman. And you know, the Welsh have found numerous examples of this. And the Smithsonian, they like to call it expertizing the collection. That means bringing indigenous people through and having them get rid of bogus documentation and actually document it properly. I would argue that documentation that is done from ignorance is not documentation. It's fraud. we need to do real documentation. We need to take it seriously. And we need to take seriously the expert knowledge. We're not the only experts, the expert knowledge of the people who made the objects. And I wanted to respond to something Henner said about looking at collecting and exhibition in new ways. I think that we must include documentation as a third and equally important stage. And it usually is not done at the same time the collecting is done. It's unusual for it to be properly documented and fully documented by the people who made it at the same time it's collected.
So as I said, really the idea of artifacts being repatriated is really very low on the agenda amongst the San, because there's very little in the terms of material culture that has survived, because it's largely made of, well, it's absolutely made of organic materials. So there's very little old things that could go anywhere in particular. And there's no political will or agendas around that. So information is key, and the most sensitive thing is intellectual property rights. And these are an absolutely key area, and we work with the San councils. So there's a series of San councils over Southern Africa who are very keen to protect intellectual property rights. So anything that's in the museum has gone through long conversation processes about what we can show and what we can't show. And I suppose the other side is that we're trying to work on a digital archive where we're pulling together digital assets. So so much film has been taken, and recordings, photographs. We're working with other museums like the Peabody Museum or the Pitt Rivers Museum, Peabody at Harvard and Pitt Rivers at Oxford, to bring photographs back and take them to communities and share them with communities. It's a difficult and expensive process and very time consuming, but it is something that the San consider very important and something that we consider very important.
And the financial aspect was also something that was appearing during my conversations here in Mexico, because they were saying things like, yes, you can bring the pieces back, but we don't have enough money to take enough care of them. They're cutting also our funding. So this cooperation is not only for us, for Poland, to be clear towards Mexico, but also, for example, for Mexico to be able to find information on their pieces with us. There are Polish collections in Mexico that they didn't have enough information on, and they were asking us, can you please have the catalog? Can you please establish the cooperation? Because even if we don't have enough money to bring someone from the community to your storage to check the collection, your curator can go to the storage with a camera. We have representatives of the community. They can help you establish what this object is, how should it be treated, and it can both work ways. And it's a way to work around the financial issues for all of us.